The atmosphere of the Mojave Desert did not merely heat the skin. It pursued the marrow, a relentless dry weight that pressed against the shimmering hull of the Visali scout ship. High Chancellor Kalen leaned against the curved obsidian console, his lungs burning as they filtered the nitrogen-rich air through failing internal scrubbers. The silence outside was absolute, a stark contrast to the violent cacophony of the crash that had dragged him from the upper atmosphere. Around him, the cockpit was a graveyard of holographic interfaces that flickered like dying stars, casting ghostly blue light over his pale, elongated features. He was a diplomat, a weaver of peace between star systems, yet here, amidst the creosote and the dust, he was nothing more than a fragile biological entity awaiting an inevitable end. Protocol 4 Alpha was clear. In the event of a forced landing on a Level 1 development planet, the operative must maintain total cloaking and await extraction. But the cloaking generator had been the first thing to shatter, and the extraction beacon was buried under a mountain of fused circuitry. Kalen looked out through the fractured viewport, watching the sun dip toward the jagged horizon, painting the sand in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. He knew the statistics of survival in this biome. His suit's cooling unit was leaking fluid, and his hydration reserves were depleted. The vastness of the desert felt like a predatory mouth, waiting for him to finally succumb to the stillness. A soft thud against the outer hull made Kalen's secondary heart skip a rhythmic beat. It wasn't the sound of settling metal or shifting sand. It was deliberate, the impact of something soft and fleshy. He moved to the airlock, his hand hovering over the manual release, a weapon he didn't know how to use, clutched clumsily in his other palm. As the door hissed open, a gust of hot, grit-laden wind rushed in, blurring his vision for a moment. When the dust cleared, he didn't see a military squadron or a scientific team. Standing there was a small, round human child, his face smudged with dirt and his oversized t-shirt damp with sweat. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His frame sturdy and soft, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson from the afternoon heat. He held a half-eaten stick of frozen sugar that was dripping onto his dusty sneakers, and his eyes, wide, curious, and remarkably devoid of terror, scanned the jagged edges of the alien craft. Kalen froze, his diplomatic training failing him as he stared at this primitive inhabitant who should have been screaming in retreat. The boy took a slow bite of his treat, his gaze moving from the smoking engine nacelle to the tall, shimmering figure of the Chancellor. "You're really far from the highway," the boy said, his voice high and melodic, completely unbothered by the fact that he was speaking to a creature with 4 nostrils and translucent skin. Kalen didn't respond, his universal translator struggling to lock onto the localized dialect through the static of the ship's dying core. The boy stepped closer, poking a finger at a piece of scorched carbon fiber that had fallen into the sand. He looked at the wreckage with a strange sort of clinical interest, as if he were inspecting a broken toy left out in the rain. Kalen finally managed to find his voice, though it came out as a raspy, melodic click that the translator barely softened into English. "Departure. Inhibited. Damage. Critical." He hoped the boy would understand the gravity of the situation, that he was witnessing a cosmic catastrophe. Instead, the boy just nodded sagely, as if he dealt with intergalactic shipwrecks every Tuesday before dinner. He wiped his sticky hand on his shorts and looked Kalen dead in the eye, a small, confident smile breaking across his round face. "The back end is sparking, and that big silver tube looks bent," the boy observed, pointing toward the primary ion thruster, which was currently venting a faint, toxic green gas. Kalen felt a wave of despair. The boy was right. The thruster housing was warped beyond the capabilities of a field repair, especially with the limited tools available in a scout vessel. The Diplomat sank onto the edge of the airlock ramp, the heat finally beginning to overcome his biological defenses. He was a long way from the high spires of his homeworld, and this child was the only witness to his quiet disappearance. "It is irreparable," Kalen whispered, the translator's voice sounding hollow and defeated. He looked at his long, slender fingers, built for signing treaties and playing light harps, useless against the brutal physics of a mechanical failure. He expected the boy to leave, to run back to whatever nearby settlement housed his kind, and tell tales of the monster in the dunes. But the boy didn't move. He stayed in the shadow of the wing, looking between the ship and the distant silhouette of a weathered trailer parked near a cluster of Joshua trees. "My dad says nothing is irreparable if you have the right leverage," the boy said, his tone shifting from curiosity to a strange, inherited authority. He looked at the ship once more, then back at Kalen, his eyes bright with a simple, unshakable faith. To this child, the universe wasn't a place of impossible physics or complex diplomacy. It was a place where things broke and things got fixed. It was a binary world of function and malfunction, and he lived with a man who specialized in the former. Kalen looked toward the trailer the boy was gesturing to, a rusted, corrugated metal box that looked like it was being reclaimed by the desert itself. It seemed impossible that any knowledge capable of assisting him could reside in such a desolate, primitive dwelling. He had studied Earth. He knew of their silicon chips and their combustion engines, toys compared to the graviton lattice tech of the Vesali. He began to form a polite refusal, a diplomatic way to tell the child to flee for his own safety before the ship's power cell became unstable. "My dad can fix it," the boy interrupted, his voice firm and final. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and began trudging through the sand, his gait heavy but determined. He stopped after a few yards and looked back over his shoulder, waving a chubby arm for Kalen to follow. "Come on. It's gonna get real cold soon, and Dad's got the generator running. He's got the good tools too, not the cheap stuff from the city." Kalen hesitated, the logic of his species warring with a sudden, inexplicable spark of hope. To stay was to die in the silence of the desert. To follow was to break every law of his people and risk an unpredictable encounter with an unknown adult human. He looked at the glowing embers of his ship, then at the retreating back of the boy, who walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where the horizon ended. With a heavy sigh that rattled his thin ribcage, the diplomat stepped off the ramp and into the dust, following the boy toward a destiny that no star chart could have predicted. The walk to the trailer was a grueling odyssey for Kalen, whose joints were not designed for the shifting, uneven terrain of a terrestrial desert. Each step sent a jar through his spine, and the boy, whom he learned was named Leo, chatted incessantly about things like clogged carburetors and bad gaskets, terms that the universal translator struggled to categorize as anything other than archaic mechanical jargon. As they approached the dwelling, Kalen noticed the perimeter was littered with the carcasses of Earth machinery, skeletons of rusted trucks, gutted washing machines, and heaps of tangled copper wire. To Kalen, it looked like a graveyard. To Leo, it was clearly a playground of potential parts. The trailer was a patchwork of metal and wood, anchored to the earth by heavy stones and the sheer weight of its own history. A man sat on a low stool under a tattered canvas awning, his back to them as he hunched over a piece of machinery that hissed with blue sparks. He was a large man, his frame carrying a heavy layer of fat that seemed like armor against the world, his skin tanned to the color of old leather and stained with the permanent ink of grease and oil. He didn't turn when they approached, but his hands, thick, calloused and surprisingly nimble, continued their rhythmic dance with a soldering iron. "Dad, I found a guy," Leo announced, his voice echoing against the metal side of the trailer. The man paused, the sparking stopped, and he set the iron down with a deliberate slowness. He wiped his hands on a rag that was more black than white and turned around. His eyes were deep-set and tired, framed by a wild thicket of salt and pepper beard. He looked at his son first, ensuring he was safe, and then his gaze traveled upward to Kalen. There was no scream, no reach for a weapon, just a long, evaluating silence that felt like a pressure sensor weighing Kalen's very soul. "He's got a ship, Dad. A big one," Leo continued, oblivious to the cosmic tension vibrating between the two adults. "It's broken, real bad. I told him you could fix it." The man, whose name was Thomas, stood up with a grunt, his knees popping like dry twigs. He was shorter than Kalen, but much broader, a mountain of a human who moved with a grounded, unhurried grace. He walked up to the alien diplomat, stopping just a foot away, the scent of tobacco and old diesel fumes wafting off him like a signature. Kalen felt an instinctive urge to retreat, to deploy his diplomatic persona and explain the intricacies of intergalactic law. But Thomas wasn't looking at Kalen's face. He was looking at the glowing, pulsating life support unit strapped to Kalen's chest. He reached out a hand, paused for a fraction of a second to see if Kalen would flinch, and then gently touched the translucent casing. His thumb traced a hairline fracture in the polymer, his touch light and inquisitive. "Pressure leak," Thomas mumbled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Kalen's chest. "You're losing your mix." The diplomat blinked, stunned that a man who lived in a metal box could identify a failure in a Class 7 atmospheric regulator. "You understand this technology?" Kalen asked, the translator struggling with the man's gravelly tone. Thomas let out a short, dry laugh and walked back to his workbench. He picked up a roll of heavy-duty adhesive tape and a small precision screwdriver. "Don't matter what the labels say," Thomas said without looking back. "Everything works on the same principles. Energy goes in, work comes out, friction ruins the party. If it's got a pulse, I can find the heartbeat." For the next hour, Kalen sat on a plastic crate as Thomas worked on the life support unit. The man didn't ask about Kalen's home planet, his mission, or why he looked like a walking willow tree. He simply worked. There was a profound, quiet dignity in his movements, a lack of ego that Kalen found disorienting. In the Galactic Union, engineers were elite scholars who required decades of theoretical training. Thomas, however, seemed to listen to the machine, his ears tilted toward the faint hums and clicks, his fingers feeling for vibrations that Kalen's own sensors hadn't detected. Leo sat nearby, sorting through a bin of rusted bolts, occasionally handing his father a tool before he even had to ask for it. The synergy between them was silent and absolute, a familial bond forged in the shared language of repair. Kalen watched them, realizing that he was seeing a side of humanity that the Union scouts had overlooked. The intuitive brilliance of the working class. They weren't the scientists or the politicians, they were the ones who kept the world spinning when the high-minded theories failed. As the sun disappeared completely, the desert temperature plummeted, and Thomas handed Kalen a thick, moth-eaten wool blanket. "Wrap up. Your blood's too thin for the night air," he commanded. Kalen obeyed, the scratchy fabric providing a strange comfort. Inside the trailer, a small television flickered with images of a world Kalen was supposed to be studying from a distance. But here, in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, the distance felt like a lie. He was in the heart of the human experience, a place where survival was a daily negotiation. "Why do you help?" Kalen asked suddenly, the question burning in his mind. "I am an intruder, a risk." Thomas stopped working for a moment, looking out into the darkness where the Visali lay dormant. He took a slow breath, his chest expanding like a bellows. "The world's full of things that want to break," he said quietly. "People, machines, promises. If you see something that can still work, you give it a hand. It's the only way to keep the dark from winning. Besides, my boy gave his word. I don't make a liar out of my son." The weight of that statement hit Kalen harder than the crash. It wasn't logic or curiosity that was driving this man. It was a profound sense of duty and a love for his child. As Thomas finished sealing the leak in the life support unit, the device hummed to life with a clarity it hadn't possessed even before the crash. Kalen felt the fresh air hit his lungs, pure and perfectly balanced. He looked at the grease-stained man and the chubby boy, realizing that his survival was now inextricably linked to a family the galaxy would never deem important. But the peace was short-lived. A low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floor of the trailer, a sound Kalen recognized with a cold dread. It wasn't Earth's wind or Thomas's generator. It was the sound of a Union retrieval drone, a cold, automated hunter programmed to sanitize crash sites to prevent cultural contamination. To the drone, the Visali was a target, and the humans were witnesses to be erased. Kalen stood up, his blanket falling to the floor. "They are here," he whispered. "And they do not fix things. They remove them." The air outside the trailer suddenly ionized, the smell of ozone overpowering the scent of sagebrush. A pillar of white light descended from the clouds, illuminating the desert floor with a clinical, terrifying brilliance. It was the Purge Seeker, a high-altitude drone designed for scorched earth protocols. Thomas stood in the doorway, his silhouette massive against the flickering interior light. He didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed, like a man whose Sunday rest had been interrupted by a persistent solicitor. He reached for a heavy iron wrench on the counter, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the handle. "Stay inside, Leo," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a register of steel. The boy nodded, his usual chatter silenced by the sheer gravity in his father's tone. He crawled under the small kitchen table, clutching a tattered teddy bear, his eyes fixed on Kalen. The alien diplomat felt a crushing guilt. His presence had brought a celestial executioner to this humble doorstep. He rushed to the door, trying to push past Thomas. "I must go out! If I surrender, they may spare the dwelling!" Kalen cried, but the man didn't move an inch, his heavy frame as solid as the mountains. "You're a guest in my house," Thomas growled, not looking back. "And I don't let my guests get picked off by overgrown flashlights." He stepped out into the dirt, the wind whipping his beard. Above them, the drone hovered, its many-lensed eye rotating as it scanned the area. It identified Kalen behind the man and emitted a high-frequency pulse that shattered the windows of the trailer. Glass rained down like diamonds, and Leo let out a small, muffled whimper. The drone's underside began to glow with a lethal crimson energy, charging its primary thermal lance. Kalen watched in horror as the drone's targeting laser settled on Thomas's chest. The human stood his ground, a fat man in a stained undershirt, facing down the pinnacle of galactic warfare. But Thomas wasn't just standing there, he was observing. His eyes moved with lightning speed, tracing the cables that fed into the drone's exposed cooling vents, a design flaw Kalen had never noticed. Thomas knew machines. He knew that the more complex they were, the more spectacular their failure points became. He knew that everything, even a godlike machine, had a nut that could be loosened. With a roar that sounded more like a cornered bear than a man, Thomas didn't attack the drone directly. Instead, he lunged for the heavy-duty diesel generator that powered the trailer. With a surge of strength that seemed to defy his physical condition, he ripped the heavy lead-acid batteries from their housing and began to manipulate the wiring with a frantic, expert precision. He was building a localized EMP, a crude, desperate fix to a problem that required a scalpel, but he only had a sledgehammer. The drone fired. A beam of red heat sliced through the air, missing Thomas by inches and turning a pile of scrap metal into a pool of molten slag. The heat was unbearable, singeing Thomas's hair and blistering his skin. But he didn't stop. He slammed two massive cables together just as the drone repositioned for a killing blow. A massive arc of blue electricity erupted from the generator, channeled through a copper coil Thomas had rigged to a satellite dish. The surge of raw, unrefined Terran power slammed into the drone's sophisticated sensors. The Purge Seeker shrieked, a mechanical sound of agony that tore through the night. Its lights flickered wildly, its gravity drive sputtered, and it began to spin out of control. It was built to resist high-tech hacking and plasma fire, but it wasn't built for a direct, messy surge of 240-volt alternating current delivered via a rusted TV dish. The drone crashed into a sand dune 50 yards away, its internal systems melting into a useless heap of silicon and alloy. Silence returned to the desert, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the mechanic. Thomas collapsed to his knees, his hands blackened and shaking. Kalen rushed to him, his translucent skin pale with shock. He reached out to help the man, but Thomas waved him off, slowly pushing himself back to his feet. He looked at his ruined generator and his shattered windows, then at the smoking wreck of the drone. There was no triumph in his expression, only a deep, weary sadness. He had protected his home, but the world he knew had been irrevocably breached by the extraordinary. Inside the trailer, Leo emerged from under the table. He didn't look at the drone, he looked at his father. He saw the burns on his arms and the exhaustion in his eyes. The boy walked over and silently handed his father a clean rag, his small face set in a mask of grim understanding. He knew his father was a hero, but he also knew the cost of being the one who fixes things. The ship was still broken, the Diplomat was still stranded, and now they were being hunted by the stars themselves. Kalen looked at the father and son, realizing that the logic of his people was a brittle thing. They would have analyzed the drone, calculated the odds, and accepted their fate, but this human, this man who spent his days under the hoods of broken cars, had looked at an impossible machine and saw only a project that needed a forceful adjustment. The break wasn't just in the machinery, it was in Kalen's understanding of the universe. Power didn't come from technology, it came from the refusal to let things stay broken. "We need to move," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "That thing had friends, didn't it?" Kalen nodded solemnly. "A fleet will follow the signal loss." Thomas looked at the Visali in the distance, its silhouette dark against the rising moon. He wiped the soot from his forehead and looked at Leo. "Pack the toolbox, son. The big one. We're going to go make that silver bird fly again." The boy didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy steel box, and for the first time, Kalen saw the same steel in the child's eyes that he saw in the father's. The trek back to the ship was a race against a clock Kalen couldn't see but could feel in the vibration of the atmosphere. Thomas walked with a limp now, his body protesting the trauma of the EMP blast, but he refused to slow down. He carried a heavy bag of mismatched tools, wrenches, hammers, rolls of wire, and jars of industrial solvent. It was a ludicrous sight, a galactic diplomat being escorted by a wounded mechanic and a boy to repair a vessel that utilized quantum entanglement propulsion. Yet Kalen found himself believing in the impossible, because he had seen the man wrestle a god and win. When they reached the Visali, the interior was a tomb. The secondary power had failed, and the air was stale. Thomas didn't wait for instructions. He began tearing away the sleek, seamless panels of the engine room with a crowbar, a sight that made Kalen's diplomatic heart ache. "You are damaging the aesthetic integrity," Kalen managed to say. Thomas didn't even look up as he pried away a panel of iridescent alloy. "Aesthetics don't get you off the ground, buddy. Parts do. Now show me where the fire starts." For hours, the desert was filled with the sounds of primitive labor echoing inside a futuristic shell. Thomas was deep in the bowels of the ship, his hands covered in a mixture of black oil and glowing violet coolant. He discovered that the impossible alien tech was, at its core, a heat exchange system not unlike an old boiler. He used Earth-made copper pipes to bypass shattered conduits and secured flickering crystal matrices with heavy-duty zip ties. It was a desecration of Union engineering, a Frankenstein's monster of a repair. But slowly, The ship began to groan back to life. Leo was the unsung hero of the night. The boy squeezed into the tight, narrow gaps where his father's large frame couldn't fit, his small hands threading wires through conduits designed for robotic drones. He took directions without question, his focus absolute. Kalen watched the boy, seeing the transition from a child to an apprentice. Leo wasn't afraid of the alien ship anymore. He was treating it like one of the rusted trucks in their yard. He was learning that there is no magic, only systems, and every system has a logic if you're patient enough to find it. As Thomas worked, he spoke to Kalen, not about science, but about life. He talked about Leo's mother, who had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise a boy in the middle of nowhere. He talked about the struggle to keep the lights on and the pride he felt when a neighbor's tractor finally roared to life after a week of frustration. Kalen listened, realizing that for Thomas, fixing things was a way of grieving and a way of loving. It was his language, his prayer. Every bolt he tightened was a statement that he would not let the world fall apart around his son. The ship's AI suddenly flickered to life, its voice distorted and glitchy. System compromised, unauthorized, organic interference detected. Kalen rushed to the console, his fingers flying across the holographic keys. He had to override the security protocols before the ship self-destructed to prevent contamination. He spoke in his native tongue a series of melodic commands that sounded like a song. The AI settled, its red warning lights turning to a hesitant amber. The ship was confused by its own existence, part starlight and part scrap metal. Outside, the sky began to hum. The fleet was arriving. Dozens of lights appeared in the upper atmosphere, descending like a curtain of falling stars. Kalen knew they wouldn't negotiate. They would see the corrupted ship and the humans, and they would glass the entire sector. He looked at Thomas, who was currently hammer-tapping a bent fuel line back into shape. "You must leave," Kalen said, his voice trembling with an emotion he hadn't known his species could feel. "Love, if they find you here, there is no repair for what they will do." Thomas emerged from the engine pit, his face a mask of grease and exhaustion. He looked at the sky, then at his son, then at the alien he had saved. He didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he handed Leo a heavy wrench and pointed toward the final coupling. "Finish it, Leo, just like we practiced on the Chevy." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded, disappearing back into the machinery. Thomas turned to Kalen and wiped his hands. "I'm not done yet, and I don't leave a job half-finished." The transformation in Thomas was subtle, but profound. The fat human was gone. In his place stood a master of the physical world. He had spent his life being underestimated by the people in the city, by the government, and now by the stars. But in this moment, he was the most important being in the galaxy. He was the bridge between the impossible and the functional. He grabbed two severed power leads, his eyes locked on Kalen. "When the light turns green, you hit the throttle. Don't look back." The first of the Union's tactical ships landed a mile away, its engines kicking up a massive dust cloud. Kalen felt the vibration of their heavy weaponry powering up. He looked at the console. The power levels were at 40%, then 50%. It wasn't enough for a jump, but it was enough to clear the atmosphere. He looked at Leo, who popped his head out of the floorboards, giving a thumbs up with a greasy hand. The boy was beaming, a pure, radiant joy at having made the silver bird breathe again. In that moment, the consequence of their meeting was clear. Kalen would never be the same diplomat. He would be a revolutionary who knew the power of the lowly. Leo would never be just a boy. He would be the man who knew the stars were just another engine to be understood. And Thomas would be the legend that the stars tried to erase but couldn't, because he had built his legacy in the heart of a machine that now carried a piece of his soul into the vacuum of space. The engine roared. Not the clean, musical hum of a Visali vessel, but a guttural, aggressive thrum that vibrated the very sand beneath the hull. It was the sound of Earth's defiance woven into alien grace. Kalen slammed his hand onto the activation plate, and the ship lurched upward, sand cascading off the wings like golden rain. Below, the Union ships were mere seconds from firing, but the Visali was already a blur of motion, fueled by Thomas's desperate bypasses and Leo's steady hands. They broke the sound barrier with a crack that echoed across the Mojave, leaving the desert behind. For a few minutes they were in the silent embrace of the upper atmosphere. Kalen looked at the monitors. The ship was holding, though the life support was being filtered through an old truck cabin filter Thomas had found in his bag. He turned to the two humans who sat in the navigator seats, looking out at the curvature of the earth. Leo was pressed against the glass, his mouth open in wonder, seeing his world not as a dusty desert, but as a shining blue marble. Thomas sat back, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, victorious rhythm. "I have marked the coordinates for your home," Kalen said softly, the ship's internal gravity making his voice sound deeper. "I will drop the escape pod near your trailer. The Union will not find you. I have purged the logs of your DNA." He paused, looking at the man who had changed his destiny. "How can I repay this? In my world, we give titles, lands, energy cores. What does a man like you require?" Thomas opened one eye and looked at the diplomat, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. "Just tell 'em," Thomas said, his voice a whisper. "Tell those folks up there that just because something looks broken or ugly on the outside doesn't mean the heart isn't pure gold. And maybe tell them to build their engines a little tougher. Too many fancy parts." He chuckled, a dry sound that ended in a cough. He reached out and ruffled Leo's hair. The boy looked at his father, then at Kalen, and his expression was one of profound peace. He had seen the stars, and he knew his dad could fix those too. The descent of the escape pod was a quiet affair. They landed softly in the darkness, a few miles from the smoking ruin of the trailer. As the pod doors opened, the familiar scent of sagebrush and cold desert air rushed in. Thomas stepped out first, his boots hitting the familiar dirt with a heavy thud. He reached back and lifted Leo out, setting him down on the ground. They stood together in the shadow of a Joshua tree, watching as the Visali, now a faint spark of light, accelerated toward the deep black of the outer system. Kalen watched them from the ship's rearview sensors until they were nothing more than specks in the vastness. He knew his return to the Union would be difficult. He would be questioned, perhaps even exiled for his contamination. But he didn't care. He carried with him a secret weapon, the knowledge that the universe's most powerful force isn't antimatter or dark energy. It is the quiet, stubborn persistence of a man with a toolbox and the unshakable faith of a child who believes his father can mend the world. Back on the ground, Thomas and Leo began the long walk back to their site. The trailer was a mess, the windows were gone, and the generator was a hunk of melted lead. To anyone else, it was a disaster, a life ruined by a freak encounter. But as they walked, Leo looked up at his father, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Hey, Dad?" the boy asked, his voice steady. Thomas looked down at him, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Yeah, Leo?" The boy gestured toward the darkened, silent trailer. "Can we fix it?" Thomas stopped and looked at the wreckage of his life. He saw the work ahead, the hours of cleaning, the scavenging for parts, the cold nights before the heat would be restored. He felt the burns on his arms and the ache in his bones. But then he looked at his son, the boy who had led an alien across the sand because he believed in his father's hands. Thomas knelt down, pulled a small, silver alien bolt from his pocket, a souvenir of the Visali, and pressed it into Leo's palm. "Yeah, son," Thomas said, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming pride. "We can fix it. We've got the tools and we've got the time. Besides, I think the neighbors are going to have some questions about that drone in the dunes. We might need to fix their tractors for free for a while to keep them quiet." They shared a laugh, a human sound that filled the empty desert with a warmth that no sun could provide. They were just two people in a vast universe, but they were not small. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the mechanic and his son reached the edge of their property. Thomas picked up a discarded wrench from the sand, wiped it on his pants, and tossed it into the air, catching it with a practiced ease. The world was broken, the stars were dangerous, and the future was uncertain. But as they stepped onto the porch of their battered home, one thing was absolutely certain. As long as there was a problem to be solved, they would be there to meet it. The story of the Visali would become a legend among Kalin's people. The ship of the mechanic. It would be studied for centuries, not for its technology, but for the strange, crude repairs that allowed it to survive. And on a small, dusty planet in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, a chubby boy would grow up to be a man who never looked at a broken machine and saw an end. He only saw a beginning, because he remembered the night the stars came down and his dad fixed them.